There is a conversation that Britain is not having. Not the one about left and right and tax and spend, about who is in power. A different one, older, about what we owe each other, what holds a community together without the law requiring it. What used to be transmitted from one generation to the next and is no longer being transmitted at all. This channel does not explicitly do left or right. This video is not going to be kind to either of those sides. Both have failed on this in different ways at different times with different justifications. And both failures have landed on the same people, the ones at the bottom who needed the social infrastructure most and found it was no longer there. The social contract is not a document. It is not legislation. It is the unwritten agreement between individuals and the society they are part of. What you put in is what you get back. What you owe people you will perhaps never even meet. What holds civilization together when law is not watching? It used to be transmitted by families, by communities, by the culture, by the shame of falling short and the pride of meeting the standard. Those mechanisms are degraded and we are living with the consequences. So next I'm going to talk about the contract, what it is and what it requires. So let us start with what the social contract actually contains. Not the philosopher's version, the practical one, the one that used to be taught by showing, not telling. So let's start off with what you owe. You work if you are able to work, not because the law requires it, but because the alternative, living off benefits of others indefinitely without contributing, violates something fundamental about membership in a community. Work is not just income, it is identity, structure, social connection, the discipline of showing up, the dignity of contributing something. When we removed the expectation of work, we did not liberate people from drudgery. We removed the thing that gave a significant number of people their only reliable source of purpose and structure. You contribute to the community you live in, not necessarily in money, but in behavior. You do not make the street worse for everybody else. You do not make the block noisier, more dangerous, more degraded. You mind your own business, which means not imposing your choices on others. You know your neighbours' names, perhaps. You do not vandalise shared space. The broken window principle is not a metaphor. It is the documented evidence that visible disorder produces more disorder, because disorder communicates what is acceptable. And you raise your children to the standard that society requires, not your standard, the social standard, the one that allows your children to participate in mainstream economic and civil life. That means professional etiquette, the ability to defer gratification, respect for authority, not blind obedience, but functional respect for the institutions that make cooperation possible. The difference between having a problem with a specific police officer and having a problem with the concept of policing. So next we're going to talk about what you get back. In return for contributing, you receive protection from crime, from arbitrary authority, from exploitation. You receive opportunity, not guaranteed outcomes, but genuine access to the pathways that lead to better outcomes. You receive the right to be left alone, to make choices about your own life without the state or your neighbours imposing their values on you. And you receive the dignity of being treated as a capable adult, not a helpless dependent. So next I'm going to talk about shame, where it went, and pride as social technology. Shame gets a bad press. I guess it deserves some of it. Pathological shame, the kind that destroys rather than corrects, is genuinely damaging. But functional shame, the discomfort of behaving in ways that fall below your own standard, is essential for social technology. It is the internal governor that operates when no external one is present. A society without the function of shame is a society where the only check on behaviour is the law, and that can't be everywhere and produces compliance without conviction. Pride is the other side of the same coin. Pride in what you have built, in what you have earned, in the reputation of your family and your community, You cannot have one without the other. And when you remove shame, you remove pride. And when you remove both, you get what you have. A culture where achievement is not celebrated because it implies that those who have not achieved could have. And where failure is not acknowledged because it implies that the person who failed had agency in the matter. These values are not Western values. They are not conservative values. They are human infrastructure. The Japanese concept of maiwaku, not causing inconvenience to others, is the same principle. The African concept of Ubuntu, I am because we are, is the social contract stated directly. Or Confucian, respect for elders. Islamic obligation of community contribution through zakat. These civilizations arrived at the same conclusions independently because the conclusions are correct. They are what makes cooperation between strangers possible, and cooperation between strangers is what civilization is. So next I'm going to talk about what the left abandoned, rights without responsibilities. The welfare system was one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century. The principle that civilized society does not allow its members to starve, or to die of preventable diseases, or to be destitute in old age. That principle is correct. The argument is not with the principle, the argument is what has happened to it. So next I'm going to talk about how the safety net became a ceiling. A safety net catches you and bounces you back. What Britain has built, incrementally, with good intentions at every stage, is something different. It's a floor. And when the floor is high enough and comfortable enough, a significant number of people stop climbing. Not because they are necessarily lazy in some moral sense, but because the human animal optimizes for its environment. When the environment provides enough, the drive to provide more diminishes. That's not necessarily a failing, it's biology. And the policy question is, what kind of environment are we designing? In 2025-2026, the UK will spend £323 billion on the welfare system. 23.6% of all government spending, which is nearly a quarter. Over 5 million people are claiming welfare with no work requirements. 1 in 8 young people, which is 946,000, are NEET, N-E-E-T, not in education, employment or training. The number of working age people on incapacity benefits reached a post-financial crisis high of 7% in 2023-2024 and is forecast to reach an all-time high of 7.9% by 2028 to 2029. These are not numbers that describe a society where misfortune is being adequately caught by a compensation safety net. They are numbers that describe a society where a significant and growing number of people have been designed out of economic participation. The system that was supposed to support people toward independence is trapping a growing number of people into dependency. And the left, which built this system with the best of intentions, has been largely unwilling to say so because saying so feels like attacking the people the system was supposed to help. So next I'm going to talk about rights without responsibilities. The progressive project of the past 40 years has been, in significant part, a project of rights expansion. Rights are important, but the conversation about rights crowded out the conversation about responsibilities. Every right has a corresponding obligation. The right to housing creates an obligation not to damage it. The right to education creates an obligation to attend and to engage. The right to benefits creates an obligation to work towards not needing them. When the language of rights became the only language available and the language of obligation became politically toxic, the social contract lost one of its two pillars. The left also made a specific error on standards. In the name of inclusion and equality, it became hostile to the idea of a standard itself. Grading systems were softened. Discipline in schools became contested. The expectation that certain behaviours were unacceptable was reframed as cultural imposition. And in the communities that most needed clear standards, the ones where the family and community transmission of norms had already broken down, the removal of institutional standards left a vacuum. You cannot remove a standard without replacing it with something, and nothing is not a replacement. Nothing is just chaos with a more compassionate name. Next, I'm going to talk about benefits should not be a lifestyle choice. There is a sentence that used to be sayable and became politically difficult to say. So this channel is going to say it. Benefits should not be a lifestyle choice. The welfare system was designed as a safety net, temporary support for people in genuine hardship, with the direction of travel always pointing towards independence. At some point, the desire became to accommodate permanence. The language changed. Long-term benefits stopped being described as a problem to be solved and became a, quote, way of living, to be respected even. The cultural shift that followed is measurable in numbers already cited. 5 million with no work requirements, incapacity benefits heading for an all-time high, a generation of young people who have never had a job. This is not an argument against supporting people who genuinely cannot work. It is an argument about what the system communicates. When benefits are permanent and unconditional, the system communicates that not working is an acceptable long-term outcome. When benefits are temporary and conditional, when they carry an expectation of movement towards independence, the system communicates something entirely different. The expectation is not cruel. The expectation is respect. It says, we believe you can do better. We will support you while you get there. The removal of expectation says the opposite. So next I'm going to talk about the entitlement attitude. Entitlement is distinct from rights. Rights are the things that a society guarantees to its members in exchange for their participation. Entitlement is the expectation of those things without participation. It is the belief that what you have not earned is nonetheless owed to you by government, by employees, by the people around you, by life itself. The entitlement attitude produces a specific failure mode. The person who blames every obstacle on everyone except themselves, who explains every shortfall as evidence of injustice rather than as information about what needs to change, who meets feedback with grievance rather than adjustment. The entitlement attitude is not confined to any class or any community, and I think that's very important. It appears at the bottom of the income distribution and at the top. The wealthy sense of entitlement, that rules do not apply to you, that your position exempts you from ordinary accountability, is as corrosive as the benefits-dependent version. The difference is that the wealthy entitlement is largely invisible because it produces outcomes that look like success. The working class entitlement is visible in its consequences: unemployment, conflict with authority, relationships that collapse under the weight of unreciprocated expectation. So next I'm going to talk about benefits as a lifestyle choice. There is a sentence that needs to be said because it is true and because both sides of politics have been reluctant to say it. Benefits should not be a lifestyle choice. This is not an attack on people in difficulty. The safety net exists for a reason, and that reason is correct. The attack is on a system design that has made long-term dependency not just possible, but in some cases rational, where the calculation between working and not working, factoring in childcare, travel, and the loss of means-tested benefits produces a rationale for not working. That outcome was designed into the system. The system then expressed surprise when people chose it. The people who chose it are not stupid. They are responding rationally to the incentives they were given. The question is who designed those incentives and why they have not changed. The test of a good welfare system is not whether it provides support. Of course it should. It is whether the support is designed to move people through difficulty or to manage them within it indefinitely. A system that manages dependency rather than resolving it is not compassionate. It is administratively convenient. The difference matters enormously if you care about the person rather than the budget line. So next I'm going to talk about the denial of reality. A society that cannot answer basic empirical questions, not because the answers are genuinely contested, but because the answers have become politically inconvenient, is a society that has lost the ability to think clearly. The most visible example of this is the debate about biological sex. This channel respectfully states its position diplomatically but directly. Biological sex is binary, observable, scientifically established fact. The existence of gender dysmorphia is real, and dignity of every individual, regardless of their experience, is not in question. But a political culture that cannot distinguish between the empirical question, what is biological sex, and the ethical question, how we should treat people who experience gender differently, has confused two different conversations and made both worse. The wider problem is the pattern, not the specific example. When reality is denied because acknowledging it is uncomfortable, the policy built on that denial fails. When the evidence of what children need is set aside because it conflicts with preferred narratives about family structure, the children pay the price. When the evidence on outcomes is dismissed as culturally biased, the communities that most need evidence-based policy are the ones left with ideologically based policy instead. The progressive tradition, at its best, is empirical. At its worst, it bends the empirical to fit the ideology. The channel is for the empirical version of every argument, including this one. There is a particular failure of the progressive tradition that deserves naming precisely. When you lower the standard rather than helping someone meet it, when you pass a student who cannot read because failing them would damage their self-esteem, when you ignore antisocial behaviour because challenging it would criminalise poverty, when you excuse dysfunction because the person had a difficult life, you're not being kind. You are communicating that you do not believe they can do better. That is a form of contempt wearing the face of compassion. And the people it damages most are the ones it claims to protect. Next, I'm going to talk about what the right broke values as a weapon. The right's failure is different in character from the left's, but equally damaging in effect. The left abandoned standards in the name of compassion. The right abandoned the people who needed the economy to work for them, and then tried to compensate for that failure by turning values into a cudgel. Next, I'll talk about the economy that made men redundant. The traditional male role in society was specific and legible. You work, you provide, you build something, your worth, your identity, your standing in the community, your attractiveness as a partner was connected to your capacity to do those things. That role was not perfect. It had costs for men and for women, but it gave men a clear answer to the question every young man asks at some point: what am I here for? Deindustrialisation answered that question by removing the economic foundation on which the answer rested. The mines closed, the factories closed, the trades that gave a man without academic talent a path to dignity and income were systematically undervalued by a political class that told everyone university was the answer. The market sorted it. It sorted an entire generation of working class men out of economic participation. And the right, which oversaw much of this process, had no alternative to offer. The market had spoken. Get educated, get a different job, move somewhere else. These are not answers. They are instructions to become a different person. The consequence was not just economic, it was psychological and social. A man who cannot fulfill the role his culture has told him is the measure of a man does not quietly recalibrate. He either finds another measure, one that does not require economic participation, which usually means dominance, status through crime, or withdrawal, or he collapses. The dating market, the criminal justice statistics, the addiction numbers, the suicide rates among working class men, these are not separate problems. They are the same problem wearing different faces. So next I'm going to talk about values as an imposition. The second failure of the right is what this channel has documented in other videos. The conversion of traditional values from a framework into a weapon. The difference is important. A framework says, here is what works, here is the evidence, here are the consequences of departing from it, and here is how to get there. A weapon says, you will live this way because we say so, and the authority behind us is God. When traditional values are presented as imposition rather than persuasion, they produce exactly the reaction that makes them ineffective. Compliance without conviction does not survive the first generation. The children of the forcibly devout are often the most atheist. The children of strictly traditional are the most transgressive. The right's turn towards authoritarian religion, the Douglas Wilsons, the Hegseth prayer services, the White House Faith Office is not a return to values. It is the replacement of values with power. And power, unlike genuine conviction, evaporates the moment it is not being enforced. So next I'm going to talk about narrowing the debate. The right's version of reality versus denial is different in character but equivalent in effect. Where the left says, quotes, "You cannot say this because it is harmful," the right says, quotes, "You cannot say this because it violates our values." Both are attempts to shrink the space of legitimate conversation to within the range the speaker finds comfortable. The authoritarian religious right, the version that is currently visible in American politics and beginning to appear in its British equivalent, defines the permitted conversation by theological boundary. Questions that produce inconvenient answers are ruled out of order before they can even be asked. That is not conservatism in any traditional sense. Genuine conservatism is empirical and cautious. Usually it tests change against evidence and respects what has worked before. But the authoritarian version replaces evidence with decree. Next I'm going to talk about the general role collapse and its consequences. Here is the honest version of an argument that is usually made dishonestly. The progressive culture told men that traditional male identity, provider, protector, physically capable, emotionally stoic in a functional rather than repressive sense, was toxic. It did not replace it with anything. The result is not liberated men. It is lost men. Men who have been trained out of the characteristics that have historically gave them identity, standing, and attractiveness without being given a coherent alternative. The dating market records this with brutal precision. Women, when given genuine choice, do not consistently choose the men the progressive culture was trying to produce. They choose men who have direction, capability, and the confidence that comes from having a clear sense of what they are for. Those men exist, but they are not being produced in adequate numbers. The corresponding value for women is different. The progressive culture told women that wanting partnership, family, and traditional female roles was a form of false consciousness. That genuine liberation meant career, independence, and the subordination of domestic aspiration to professional aspiration. For many women, particularly those with strong professional ambitions, this was straightforwardly liberating and correct. But for many others, women who genuinely wanted partnership and family as primary, it produced a culture that made them feel those wants were insufficiently feminist. The result, women who suppressed the instincts towards partnership and family during peak fertility years in the name of liberation that did not actually fit their preferences. And they found in their 30s and 40s that the landscape had changed. Both failures land in the same place, loneliness. Men without direction, women without partnership, both navigating a dating market that has been stripped of the social scaffolding, courtship norms, community matchmaking, the expectation of marriage as a shared goal that used to structure it. The birth rate in the UK is at a historic low. The marriage rate is declining. Reported happiness, particularly among young women, has fallen. The culture promised liberation and in significant cases delivered isolation. That is not a success. Andrew Tate exists because the church, the school, the father, and the employer all stopped telling young men what a man is. The state dismantled the economic foundation of the male role. The progressive culture told them that their traditional identity was toxic without offering a replacement. The right offered God an authority rather than dignity and pathway. And into the vacuum walked a man who tells young men something. It is largely wrong. It is often actively harmful, but something beats nothing in the human need for identity. You cannot win an argument against Tate by mocking the boys who listen to him. You win it by giving them something better to listen to. Next, I'm going to talk about inceldom as emotional rationalization. The incel, involuntarily celibate, is presented in popular culture as a figure of ridicule or threat. The channel is not interested in either. What the incel represents analytically is an endpoint of a specific failure of upbringing, not a failure of attractiveness or social skill primarily, a failure of accountability. The boy who was raised in a household where emotional protection takes priority over honest assessment, where failure is explained away, where accountability to outcome is replaced by accountability to feeling, where the question is always, quotes, how does this make you feel? Rather than, quotes, what did you do wrong? And what will you do differently? Grows into a man who cannot process failure as information. Every rejection is evidence of the world's unfairness. Every setback is someone else's fault. Every standard he cannot meet is an illegitimate standard. The emotional protection mechanism that was designed to preserve his self-esteem in childhood has become in adulthood the thing that prevents him from changing. Because change requires acknowledging that something about you needs to change. And the emotional protection mechanism does not permit that acknowledgement. This is not a small population. The manosphere exists and has millions of engaged followers because it offers men who cannot own their own failures a coherent explanation for why their failures are not their fault. Women are the problem, for example. Hypogamy is a problem. The system is rigged. Feminism did this. These explanations feel satisfying because they protected the ego. They are also catastrophically wrong as guides to action because no action they suggest will actually change the outcomes. You cannot improve your standing in the world by blaming the world for your standing. You can only improve it by changing yourself. And a man who was never taught to own failure cannot do that. Next, to talk about men learn best from men. And as a man, the conclusion of this entire analysis is simple and uncomfortable. Men do not primarily learn to be men from books, from schools, from therapy, or from women. However well-intentioned all of those may well be, men learn to be men from watching men. The quality that men a boy observes determines the ceiling of what he understands manhood to mean. High quality men, men who work, men who take responsibility, men who treat women with respect, who own their failures and learn from them, who have a clear sense of what they are for and pursue it, produce boys who understand what that looks like from the inside. Boys who have only ever seen low quality male modelling, men who don't work, who blame others, who are absent or destructive, will most often replicate what they have seen because it is the only model available. The boys who find Tate online are not looking for Tate specifically. They're looking for male modelling. They're looking for someone to answer the question, what does a man do? The answer Tate provides is wrong, but the question is legitimate. And it is a question that the boy's father, his community, his school, and his culture have all failed to answer adequately. The answer is not to silence Tate. You cannot silence the internet and you cannot silence the vacuum. The solution is to put better men in front of boys. Mentors, coaches, employers who take young men seriously and hold them to a standard. Fathers who are present and functional. Community organisations that provide male structure and male expectation. Not abstract, not therapeutic, concrete, demanding, real. Next, I'm going to talk about the cycle, how it transmits and why it sticks. The social contract does not just degrade in one generation, it transmits. The norms of a household, what is normal, what is possible, what is expected, become the baseline of the children raised in it. And the baseline, once set, is very difficult to raise from the community that set it. Next, I'm going to talk about the boy without a father. There are 3.81 million single parents in the UK. The majority are headed by mothers. This is not a judgment on those mothers. Many of them are doing exceptional work under genuinely difficult conditions. It is a structural observation about what children, and particularly boys, need. 76% of young men in prison in England and Wales had absent fathers, according to the Prison Reform Trust. Boys learn to be men by watching men. When there is no men to watch, they construct masculinity from what is available: the street, the screen, or the gang. None of these are adequate substitutes. The street teaches dominance and threat as the currency of male status. The screen offers fantasy, or increasingly the manosphere. The gang offers belonging, identity, and the clear hierarchy, which is exactly what an adolescent boy needs, delivered with catastrophic consequences. That is not the fault of the absent father in most cases. The family court system and benefit structures that financially disincentivize two-parent households and the cultural normalization of fatherlessness as just different family structure rather than a structural disadvantage for children. These are systemic failures. The fathers who were removed are not the same as the fathers who left. The channel has documented the family court dimension elsewhere. The point here is the consequence, not the cause. The specific damage to boys is worse because boys require more than explicit modelling. Girls tend to internalise social norms more readily. Boys need to see the norm performed. A boy who has never seen a man go to work, pay his bills, treat a woman with respect, and come home, who has never seen what functional male adulthood looks like from the inside, is being asked to achieve something he has never observed. The gap is not motivational, but it is informational. He does not know what he does not know. Next, I'm going to talk about the girl without a model. Women are not exempt from this analysis, and the channel does not pretend that they are. A girl raised in a household with no functioning partnership and no positive male presence and achievement below the social median is being handed a different kind of disadvantage. The traditional female role, wife, mother, the person who maintained the social and emotional infrastructure of a household, was not a prison for most of the women who inhabited it. It was a role with genuine value and genuine dignity. What replaced it in the communities the channel is describing was not liberation. It was the state acting as substitute provider, and motherhood as the available route to a home, an income, and a social role. The single parent who is not a tragic figure, but a functional strategy within the system the state has designed. The consequence, a girl who grows up in that household sees one model of adult womanhood, and it is the model without marriage, without the partner, but with the state filling the gaps. She may not consciously choose to replicate it. She may not even be aware that it is a choice available to be made differently. The aspiration to marry a suitable person before having children, to establish the dual parent household that the data consistently shows produces better outcomes for children, is not in her visible horizon. Not because she is deficient, because it is not modelled. Next, I'm going to talk about the ignorance that is genuine. The hardest thing to say about the cycle, and the most important, is that much of it is maintained by genuine ignorance rather than willful failure. The mother who does not know that her son needs a male role model is not necessarily a bad mother. She knows what she knows. The boy who does not know that professional etiquette exists, that you do not speak to an employer the way you speak to your mates, that you turn up on time, that you dress to signal that you take the opportunity seriously, is not unemployable because he is deficient. He is unemployable because nobody told him what the rules are. The rules of the mainstream economic world are obvious to people who have been shown them, but they are invisible to the people who have not been shown. This is the single most important thing the video wants to say about the communities at the bottom of the cycle. The failure is often not motivational. People want better for their kids. The failure is informational. They do not know what better looks like or what it requires or how the pathway from here to there works. And they cannot transmit what they do not have. So next I'm going to talk about how boys learn and why it matters. Boys do not primarily learn from instruction. They learn from observation and imitation. This is not cultural preference, it is developmental reality. A man who watches men around him and calibrates what male behaviour looks like, what it produces, and what is worth imitating. High quality male role models Men who work, who take responsibility, who treat women with respect, who demonstrate their efforts produces outcomes, produce high quality men from boys. Not perfectly, not automatically, but consistently across cultures and across time. The inverse is equally consistent. A boy raised in a household with no male presence, or with only low quality male presence, an absent father, an abusive one, or the peer group on the street, does not construct masculinity from scratch. He imitates what is available. If the dominant man in his environment is dominant through intimidation, crime, or the refusal to be accountable, those characteristics become the template. Not because the boy is deficient, but because the template is what was provided to him. Online communities have dramatically worsened this dynamic. A boy who would previously have been limited to imitating the men immediately around him can now access a global market of male role models curated by the algorithm toward whatever generates the most engagement. The algorithm does not optimize for a healthy male identity. It optimizes for strong emotional reaction. And the content that generates the strongest emotional reaction in a frustrated, directionless young man is the content that tells him his frustration is justified. His failure is someone else's fault, and the solution is dominance rather than development. Next, I'm going to talk about incels and the emotional male. The incel phenomenon, men who define themselves by involuntary celibacy and attribute their failures in the dating market to the malice of women and the structure of society, is not random. It is the predictable output of a specific set of conditions. Boys raised in emotionally led households without male role models who demonstrate objective self-assessment, and schooled in an environment that validated emotion over evidence, that told them their feelings were always valid, that protected them from the discomfort of failure, then released into a dating market that requires exactly the things that were never taught. Confidence built on genuine capability, the ability to absorb rejection without catastrophizing, the willingness to assess their own failures honestly and change. The specific damage of the emotionally led upbringing is this: it produces men who protect their emotions rather than examine their outcomes. When a man cannot objectively assess his own failures, when every criticism is a threat to be defended against rather than information to be used, he cannot improve. He can only excuse. And a man who can only excuse is a man who is stuck. The excuses feel protective, but they are actually the walls of a prison, possibly literally. Accountability is not punishment. It is the mechanism of change. You own the failure. You understand it. You do not repeat it. This is what high quality men model. It is what boys raised without quality men never see. So next I'm going to talk about the argument for standards, what a healthy society transmits. This video is not a nostalgia piece. The argument is not that the 1950s were better and we should go back. For many people, women who wanted careers, gay people, people of colour, people whose families were defined by violence rather than stability, the past was worse, not better. The argument is about what evidence shows produces the outcomes that children need, and the evidence is consistent. So first we're going to talk about marriage before children. Marriage as an aspiration before parenthood is not a religious or political position. It is the thing that data most consistently supports as a protective factor for children. Not because marriage is magical, but because of what it represents. A commitment between two adults to the project of raising a child together, and the legal and social structures that create accountability and stability around that commitment. The children most likely to be in poverty, most likely to be in prison, most likely to underperform educationally are the children who grow up without both parents in a stable household. That is not stigmatizing single parents. It is acknowledging structural reality. The aspiration for marriage before children is not an imposition. It is information. It is telling young people, the evidence shows this gives your children the best start. Here is what it looks like. Here is how you get there. That is not authoritarianism. That is what a society that cares about children does. Next, I'm going to talk about work as identity, not just as income. The argument for work is not primarily economic. It is psychological. Work provides structure, identity, social connection, the discipline of accountability to something outside yourself. A society that allows, through the design of its benefit system, large numbers of people to exist without working is not doing those people a favour. It is removing from them the primary mechanism by which adults construct meaning and standing. The Centre for Social Justice is finding that the most effective route back to work is work experience. Not money, not training, but actual experience. Confirms what common sense already suggests. The pathway is learned by walking it. Next, I'm going to talk about respect for elders as knowledge transmission. The generation that grew up in genuine scarcity, the people who lived through the post-war period, who understood what it meant to have nothing and build from it, carries knowledge that cannot be learned from a YouTube video. The discipline of delayed gratification, the understanding that discomfort is survivable, the ability to distinguish between a problem and inconvenience. When that generation is warehoused in care homes rather than integrated into family and community life, the knowledge goes with them. The young people who need it most are the ones least likely to have access to it. Next, I'm going to talk about accountability as respect. Holding someone accountable for their behaviour is not cruelty. It is the opposite. When you do not hold someone accountable, when you explain away their failure, when you remove the consequence, when you tell them the system is the problem and they are just the victim, you are communicating that you do not believe they have agency. You're implying that their choices do not matter, that they cannot do better. That is the deepest form of disrespect, because it removes from them the one thing that makes human beings capable of change, the belief that they can. Children who are persistently disadvantaged leave school on average 22 months behind their peers. They are almost 13 times more likely to experience poor health and educational outcomes by the age of 17. Only 4 in 10 of the most disadvantaged pupils reach expected attainment at the end of school. These are not random numbers. They are the measurable consequence of what is and is not being transmitted. The question the video is asking, what would it take to change them? Not in one generation, not through a policy announcement, but over time, through the deliberate reconstruction of the social transmission mechanisms that used to carry this knowledge from one generation to the next. That means families, that means communities, that means a culture that values achievement, demands accountability, and has the honesty to say that some ways of living produce better outcomes for children than others, and to say it without apologising for saying it. So next I'm going to talk about the honest conclusion. Both sides need to hear this, the left and the right. The left needs to hear this. Compassion without standards is not compassion. It is the management of decline. A welfare system that traps people in dependency rather than supporting them towards independence is not a social achievement. It is a social failure that has been given a compassionate name. Rights without responsibilities produce people who cannot function in communities. And the removal of standards from institutions that serve the most disadvantaged communities is not inclusion. It is the withdrawal of the very infrastructure those communities most need. But the right also need to hear this. You cannot impose values. You can only transmit them. And transmission requires 2 things you've been unwilling to provide. First, the economic foundation that makes the traditional male role viable, which means caring about the deindustrialisation of working communities, caring about the skill gap, the housing market that makes family formation impossible for people without inherited wealth. Second, the persuasion rather than the coercion, showing people why the values work, not telling them they will live by these values or be condemned. Both sides need to hear this. The people paying for your failures are not in the room. They are in the communities where the social contract has already broken down, where 76% of young men in prison grew up without fathers. where children are leaving school 22 months behind because no one transmitted the baseline, where a boy who has never seen a man go to work is being asked to become one without a map. So let's talk about what would actually help. Information, not policy, not more money into the same broken systems. The single most powerful intervention available is showing people what the standard looks like and how to reach it. Mentors, role models, businesses that commit to hiring from communities of need and showing young people what professional expectations look like from the inside. Schools that maintain standards rather than managing decline. Communities that celebrate achievement rather than resenting it. The values the social contract requires are not complicated. Work, contribute, raise your children with the investment they deserve. Respect the law as a shared resource rather than the enemy. Know your neighbours. Mind your own business. Which means not imposing your choices on others. Have the pride to hold yourself to a standard and the shame to be uncomfortable when you fall below it. Aspire to something. Show your children what aspiring looks like. These are not right-wing values. They are not religious values. They are not middle-class values that working-class people cannot achieve. They are the values that every functioning human community has arrived at independently, because they are the minimum required for people to cooperate with each other over time. They are what the social contract actually contains, and they are what both sides of politics in different ways have stopped teaching. Someone has to start again. It might as well as be us. So in conclusion, this video is about a failure that predates institutions and outlasts them. The failure of a culture to transmit what it knows to the people who need it. I've done a democracy video, a profit video, the Alliance Without Limits video. They're all on the channel. They're all worth a watch, works of art. And they are all versions of the same question. Who is accountable and to whom? The social contract is the foundation under all of them. When it degrades, everything built on it becomes unstable. Please like and subscribe. Share this with somebody who needs to hear it. All the videos are on the channel, and thank you.